Hello and welcome. Today's COP29 episode is a chat with Peter Castellas, Chief Executive of Climate Zeitgeist. Peter founded Climate Zeitgeist to catalyse investment in business solutions that address climate change, and its activities include the annual Climate Investor Forum, which connects investors and climate change solutions providers. Peter was previously Chief Executive of Tasman Environmental Markets, where he led the company to become one of the largest voluntary carbon offset providers in the Asia Pacific. And before that, he was Chief Executive of the Carbon Market Institute. He's also worked in senior sustainability and finance roles with Deloitte and the Commonwealth Bank. Peter talks about the COP with a strong focus on progress being made on rules for carbon markets, which are a key instrument that enables cooperation between countries and companies on tackling climate change. These rules are being established under what's known as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 comprises three parts, two of which are market mechanisms. Article 6.2 provides for market-based exchanges of emissions abatement between countries, and Article 6.4 provides for a UN-administered carbon market. Welcome, Peter. Firstly, in your already stellar career, what are you most proud of so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think I'm most proud of, and maybe it's related to being at this COP, is that I'm most proud of the fact that people I've recruited and have worked for me and with me over the years are actively building their careers in this place and making a great contribution. They're people that I have a fondness for, a friendship with, and respect for. But to see even last night, I was out with, 5 people who are all in different roles that I worked with, and I was running the Carbon Market Institute, and they're all doing different things. But they're all, it's almost like in an Australian football analogy, a coach who, whose players go on to coach other teams themselves. So I feel that feels great for me. And even my son is, I'm very proud of him. He works in the climate change space in pollination in Washington, D.C. And so I suppose I'm most proud of the fact that I've been able to, in a small way, help some people in their career, and then sort of to see them really make contributions is really satisfying.
That's a great response, Peter, and I knew you couldn't avoid dropping in an AFL reference somewhere along the way. We were talking earlier, and you were saying arrangements to operationalise Article 6 carbon markets are almost good to go. Could you expand on that?
The global agreement for setting the rules around how countries can trade carbon and establish a global carbon market or country-to-country carbon market are now at the point where there is the detail around how the standards and the methodologies and the technical oversight of some of the way projects can be implemented and then issued credits is now at that point where we're getting a broad framework agreement, and now we have to go into the detail, which is the technical stuff to operationalize the market. So this has been delayed, but it's now at a point where there's expectations that within the next year that the rules can be fully codified and approved by the parties, and we can start having a globally governed and guided carbon market.
When people come up to you and say, "Oh, I don't trust carbon markets," really, each company, each country should just focus on its own decarbonisation agenda. What's your response to that?
That there's a need to provide climate finance for vulnerable ecosystems, and to be able to contribute as part of the global decarbonisation efforts. Funding climate projects is a really is a way with integrity to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere or avoid emissions. So the reality is, when on the ground you talk to people that have received the funding from carbon projects, that where it's needed most is something that the critics of the carbon market get caught up in technical details. And although the markets have been something that requires constant scrutiny and constant upgrading of standards, we've had 20 plus years of actually the monitoring and reporting and verification. So critics of the carbon market, I think, don't fully appreciate that we are not going to get to net zero without the use of carbon credits. We're not going to get to net zero, corporates or countries, without the use of carbon markets. So I think they're always open to be critiqued, but we're at a point where we've got a lot of lessons learned and a lot of great outcomes that we've seen how climate finance can provide carbon projects that actually really deliver the real outcomes. So that the challenge for the critics of the carbon market and is something that I think we still have to overcome to have a fully integrated approach to reducing emissions globally.
There has been a lot of work gone into strengthening the integrity of international carbon markets over the past 2 years, really. And that work has, to a very large extent, now been finalised. Do you think that's been important in giving negotiators the confidence to make the progress that they've made so far?
I think it's a really important point, is that there's so much work that's going into creating frameworks for how projects can be evaluated, how they can be rated, the principles that they operate under, and there's a lot of international work going on establishing what those sort of core principles are that demonstrate what a good project is. So there's more confidence coming all the time in terms of the efficacy of the kinds of projects that receive climate finance.
Could you give a couple of examples? I mean, I think we've talked about it, I guess, in abstract terms, but if you could give a couple of examples of how countries might engage in trading under this new mechanism, well, both 6.4 and its and the other part of Article 6, which is Article 6.2.
Yeah, the 6.2 is one where so we've already started to see some evidence of how it could operate. If you take a country, let's just use Australia as an example, Australia and say Bhutan. If we were to establish a country-to-country connection under 6.2, where Australia would be taking the emissions that are created from the preservation of forests, for example. A country like Bhutan has a zero carbon or a carbon negative profile in terms of its commitment under the United Nations nationally determined contributions. So there's the ability to effectively export those credits to countries like Australia or Japan or Korea that or Singapore that might actually be able to use those under their own country's nationally determined contributions, which means that countries like Australia or Singapore can be more ambitious in terms of what their total emissions reduction profile. It's not either or. It's what the decarbonisation efforts that are happening in the country can be complemented by investing in other countries and using those emissions towards Australia's, for example, nationally determined contribution. It's climate reduction targets. And so the benefits then work is that there's investment in projects into developing countries that can actually use those funds, to preserve those vulnerable ecosystems and enhance communities. The emissions are calculated and then transferred, so they're not counted on both countries. They're transferred to a country like Australia. Australia can actually then be more ambitious with its commitment on top of its own domestic emissions reduction. It can actually then use these internationally traded units to be more ambitious to get to that net zero. So the way the countries, that two parties can work, some of those are playing out now in memorandums of understanding. And I think that's what the Article 6.2 under the negotiations under the UNFCCC will allow a lot more of those bilateral arrangements to be established.
You mentioned Singapore there in your answer, and Singapore has actually been very active on this front. Could you tell us a bit about what they've been doing?
Yeah, Singapore is an exemplar of a country which is not only establishing the domestic platforms for carbon trading. It's providing through its government funds and investment vehicles into carbon projects, into carbon businesses and platforms to affect the trading. It's elevated carbon markets into its strategy to actually have ambitious targets itself. It's extending memorandums of understanding and trying to work out how bilateral arrangements can happen between countries. And really, it's providing the catalytic capital for impactful solutions for climate action. It's a country that it actually is taking, in my view, a real leadership role and helping to plug the climate finance gap, but also being proactive in terms of how their own country's emissions trading scheme can happen, because they are putting a price on carbon on their own economy and then facilitating a compliance market for trade. So on multiple fronts, Singapore is embedding carbon markets in domestic compliance, in international negotiations, in aid, trade and diplomatic efforts, and is providing, as I say, the much needed impetus for the way carbon markets can be operationalised.
It's not the case that these markets are always inevitably going to operate perfectly. What sort of guardrails does each country have to have in place, I guess, to make sure that their participation in the market works in a way that's positive for them?
I think everyone participating in carbon markets, be it at a country level, or through a company strategy, or at an operational level on the ground, has to build a competency to be able to ask the right questions and do the appropriate due diligence. There is a lot of technical detail required to be able to assess a carbon project or a carbon project developer, to understand the methodology, to be able to make the right decisions around pricing, around to be able to determine risks for supply. So there's a lot of components that require for a country to participate in carbon markets and for companies to participate. You've got to build the competency to be able to understand and ask the right questions. So trade in any type of commodity requires that. There's different types of gold, for example, different carats of gold. And so it has different pricing. And it's kind of one way to look at the carbon market. There's different projects that are under different methodologies. They have a different price. They have a different sort of schedule for the issuance or the amount of tons of carbon over different periods of time. So there's all these variables, but so to understand why the standards are really important is to provide some guidance for people and for countries to be able to actually differentiate between projects. And so it all comes down to understanding the risk. And so there is risk in any traded commodity. And so if carbon is one of those, then what is it that you need to understand and the questions you need to ask around the risk? So you're managing that. There is always going to be some challenges in terms of being able for projects to meet their full emission reduction requirements. And so some of the standards build in buffers. So you might not get the full number of tonnes every year on what was modelled because they're holding some in reserve in case there is a reversal, like a bushfire for forests, for example. So there are guardrails in the standards and the rules, and the guardrails that need to be applied for those involved in making a decision to trade. They have to actually know what questions need to be asked and understand that market. And there's a lot of expertise globally that's been built up to actually help facilitate this trade at an international level.
Can I ask you, it's negotiators who've been advancing have been responsible for the progress, I guess, on Article 6.4. You have been flat out at the COP, focusing on a range of issues. Could you tell me a bit about your experience of the COP? What have been the highlights for you?
The COP, for those people, a conference of parties, for those people who haven't attended, and even for those people that have attended, I think it's really a fascinating insight into who's doing what and how. And I liken it to the old Microsoft theme of where do I want to go to today? When you go to the country pavilions, you can dive deep into what's happening in China and get a deep insight in terms of their strategy to meet commitments under their 5-year plans and their innovation across the country. Or you could go to Canada and hear what's happening there. We can go to Denmark, or you can go into the Australian pavilion, or you can go to Suriname, or it's such a fascinating insight to hear about what countries are doing. You've then got the negotiations, which is the technical country to country negotiations, which is really complex but hard fought. And the beauty of it is that the decisions aren't made unless there's a consensus. This is such a fascinating process. So sometimes things take a long time to land, but you've got to have the world community all saying, yeah, okay, we're going to agree to it. So I think one of the things that you see on the ground here is that there is so much momentum, so much commitment and momentum into addressing climate change that it does provide a little bit of a endorphin hit to say, wow, okay, there's a lot going on. Now, it's needed because we're also seeing, the hottest temperatures on record. Emissions are still going up. We're facing a challenge where we have to, in this COP, really agree on a global finance goal. How countries will pay for the commitments that we've made as a world community. How do we unlock those billions? And I think the thing that comes through for me is it's not disconnected what's going on here with things that people back in many economies are facing, which is the cost of living. The cost of living is something that is impacted when you think about how the world supply chains are going to be impacted if there's a lack of water in the Panama Canal and ships can't get through, or the global instability for supply chains if food bowls are impacted by unseasonal monsoons, or how our food on our table, goods in our shops are going to increase if we don't actually look at how we're going to pay for countries to manage this transition to address climate action, where 2/3 of the world need that finance. And so what I think is incumbent on people who come to a COP is to be able to communicate back into their own countries in a way to connect what are the things that are front in mind for people, which is their hip pocket and their cost of living. The stuff that goes on over here is actually a way to mitigate that getting worse.
Yep. That is a wonderful answer. Can I ask you, is it also an area where, is a COP also something where deals are done? Are people just networking, or is ink put to paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the precursor to deals being done is building relationships. And there's no doubt that the people that self-select and have the ability and flexibility and support of their own organisations to be here, then get to mix with people who are from all different walks of life and industry and government perspectives committed to trying to do something. And so the relationships that come from here are ones that are sustained, and they can lead to deals. They can lead to commercial interaction. And I think when you look at things like the global carbon market and how that might evolve, just to bring it back to that, is, there's prime ministers and presidents of the countries, here going, we actually want to actually trade and participate in this market. So, building a relationship at the most senior level of the country is really important, because once we operationalise it, then those relationships have been struck. The commitment to actually wanted to participate, the intention to do deals is there. And I think the thing that where the really innovative stuff that I'm seeing at this COP that haven't seen it as much in previous COPs is all the conversation around blended finance, the different financial institutions, whether it's philanthropy or multilateral development banks or private equity or institutional funds or sovereign wealth funds. There's this really encouraging conversation about how do we get more money into this from the private sector, and how do we align it with public funds, and what does that blended finance, those blended finance vehicles look like? They're the things that can translate to deals that are done post something like this. The conversations are rich, the key decision makers are here, and the follow-ups then become something that might translate to the way we might create really interesting and new investment vehicles in technologies, projects and markets that help us transition.
That's a great answer. What in your working life, your current working life is focused on driving investment into climate change solutions. Often that's done or it requires driving finance into startups who have their own challenges. They bring creativity and they bring passion, I guess, but they don't necessarily bring money. Does the COP deal with those issues at all? Have you found those issues discussed?
There's one thing that comes out in my mind going sort of, I suppose, to the heart of your question, is that there's a lot of innovation that's taking place around the world, and it does come from individuals and universities and country commitments to R&D and corporate investment as well. So there's so much innovation. So the question, I think, comes back to, well, how does that scale? And what you get from a COP is a demand signal. There is a very, very strong market signal. The Paris Agreement is the mother of all market signals. The emissions reduction trajectory is down. And so that is reconfirmed here. So if you've got a business model looking to scale up, and you want to know there's a demand. An investor in that business wants to know there's going to be, future revenue streams. So what the COP does, I think, is at a macro level consolidates the fact that there is a demand. So if you're an innovator, if you're an entrepreneur, you've got to be able to then go not only create a viable product or service or project, but you've got to make the connections with the buyers. And so there's a lot of interest in the climate as an investment theme in these technologies, because smart, savvy investors see that demand coming from corporates, countries, and globally. And so then it's then incumbent on that innovator and the stakeholders in that solution to then find the buyer. And the exciting thing about what a COP is one way of actually highlighting that is the buyers are starting to come into the room. corporate balance sheets are getting unlocked. There's a lot of innovation that corporates are now doing to meet their targets, and then countries to meet those. So the COP is more around the buyers being the countries. So what are these big economies doing to transition their economy? They're sending that signal, and then the corporates, which are not as prominent as countries. But I think making that connection, the COP really sends a really strong market signal that there's a lot of growth in innovation to come and scale to come.
My last question, is there one fact that you wish more people knew about or were cognizant of, that you think if it was more widely known, it would help us make faster progress towards a cleaner, greener, better world?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I'm going to say that I reckon climate change to where we are is reversible. Big statement, but I think it's reversible. I think we can actually bend, and I'm thinking about a longer arc, of our history as a species, that we actually have a long few, many generations ahead of us. One would hope. So I'm going to say that I think there is a window where we can apply our technological innovation, our global community spirit, our leadership that needs to emerge, the value that we put on natural capital, and the way communities can be interdependent. There's a possibility. Again, I'm going to say maybe it's not a fact, but I'm going to say it's my answer is going to be climate change and global warming that we're seeing is reversible.
Thanks very much, Peter Castellas.
Great, thanks, Warry.